Well, parts of the Eastern Caribbean have really taken a lashing from Tropical Storm Elsa. This is a look at conditions in Barbados on Friday. There were reports of homes that collapsed as well as power and water outages. Thankfully, no reports of deaths or serious injuries here. So we are watching a storm that is rather more disorganized right now. It is a strong tropical storm. The hurricane hunters are flying into the system right now to get a better sense of what's going on, but it's been sheared over the last 24 hours, and that's a big part of why it has looked a little bit less organized, also interacting with land in Hispaniola, but maybe getting a little bit more organized here in just the last couple of hours. You can see there's been a big burst of thunderstorms nearer that center of circulation. The weather has generally been behind the center of circulation, and as long as that's the case, it's not going to get terribly well organized, but that could be changing right now as the low-level center is starting to slow down a little bit. So that may be allowing these thunderstorms to sort of catch up in that mid-level center to get over top of the low-level center, and we call that vertically stacked. And when you have a system that is vertically stacked, it's got more opportunity to really get its act together and get going. So it's got some time out over the open water here, south of Haiti right now, and then it's going to be coming up north of Jamaica and then towards Cuba. And then right in there in Cuba, there are very tall mountains. And so that also could have an impact on the circulation. In general, the land interaction in Cuba is going to have an impact. The question is just how much impact will it have? So it is possible that it's not even that strong by the time it starts to come off the north coast of Cuba. Forecast calling for a 50-mile-per-hour tropical storm. It's possible that it's not even that strong, but it's also possible that if it stays south of Cuba, that it could be even stronger. So it's a highly uncertain intensity forecast in particular in this case. Molly, over to you.
Well, Carl, you know they're watching closely in Miami, especially outside of Miami in Surfside, where crews have suspended the search and rescue efforts at the condo that collapsed last week. With Tropical Storm Elsa bearing down on South Florida, officials have decided to demolish the rest of the condo towers, and that could happen as soon as tomorrow.
The governor and I sat in a meeting, and it was obvious that the building was a problem, and we agreed that the only solution for that problem was to eliminate it. We voiced those concerns to Mayor Cava, who went back and took decisive action, and instead of waiting weeks and allowing the bureaucracy to crawl, has made a very dramatic decision and signed the order to get this building taken down immediately. The fear was that the hurricane may take the building down for us and take it down in the wrong direction, on top of the pile where we have victims. I congratulate Mayor Cava for her decisive leadership in making this happen, I think as early as tomorrow, and that will allow our rescue workers to pour all over the entire site without fear of any danger from falling debris or falling buildings.
Well, time is running out for the demolition crews to bring down the rest of that condo tower. So, Carl, we want to bring you in right now. And what kind of weather are they expecting in Miami tomorrow? They're not the cone right now, but as always with hurricanes, tropical systems of any kind, you have to take into account the impacts outside of the cone.
No doubt. And, you know, this system is very right-hand loaded, as we say. So you've got the center of circulation, and then you've got all this weather on the right side of the circulation. So even if the center goes into southwest Florida, we still will be looking at some waves of rain most likely coming in. Now, I want to show you the model forecast here. Now, keep in mind, this is a model forecast showing convection. When you go out at this distance, you know, you're going out to Monday from Saturday, well, you really take it with a grain of salt, but still, it's giving you an idea that you're going to see these waves of rain coming through most likely Monday and into Tuesday. And so certainly that is going to complicate efforts there in Surfside. So there's the forecast. Scattered thunderstorms likely on Monday and then rain on Monday night. And that continues into Tuesday as well. Well, another big story we're following tonight, the dangerous and deadly heat wave in the West. And here's Molly with more on that.
We can't forget about what's happening in the West right now, where the death toll continues to rise amid a deadly heat wave in the Pacific Northwest. Oregon's medical examiner says at least 95 people have died in the state. 13 have lost their lives in Washington, while hundreds of deaths are still being investigated as heat-related in British Columbia. Seattle and Portland are among the least air-conditioned cities in America, and experts say the situation was made worse by our changing climate. We're expecting more heat in some of the same areas. You can see where we have heat advisories and excessive heat warnings that extends through the weekend. Here's the setup. Here's what's causing the heat. We have that jet stream in Canada right now, where we have a high pressure just to the south of that. It is dominant. It is in place, and it's going to strengthen as we go throughout the weekend and the beginning of next week. That's going to bring widespread temperatures once again anywhere 10 to 20 degrees above average. So we're talking about another heat wave. I don't think it's going to be as intense as what we saw earlier this week. We're not talking about all-time records breaking, but this is still really warm for this area. 90s and triple digits across much of the West. That does include hundreds and Boise, as well as Salem, even seeing the 90s. As we go to Portland, you're not getting anywhere close to that all-time record of 116 that we recently broke, but we're talking about temperatures that will be about 15 degrees above average. Your average high, you can see it up here, 79 degrees, and you're not going to see anything close to that over the next couple of days. In fact, you'll see more upper 80s and 90s than anything. And as we move over to, it's not just the heat, but it's also the active wildfires. Right now, there's 47 active wildfires in the West. Well, we're still tracking what is Tropical Storm Elsa. You can see that moving just to the south of Hispaniola right now. Where it moves across Cuba, that is the big question. We'll have more coming up.
What?
Good evening. Welcome back to Key West. I'm meteorologist Mike Seidel. Hope you're having a great 4th of July weekend. We're out keeping you safe and keeping you ahead of Elsa, now a tropical storm. But I got to show you this because this is typical of the day or 2 days before we have a tropical storm or hurricane. Beautiful weather and just gorgeous, just stunning sunsets. This is the sunset in Key West. It went down about 30 minutes ago, so we still have some twilight, some of the orange glow on the horizon, just a few little stratus clouds, and that's basically what we had today and tomorrow. It's going to be a lot of sunshine. You have all that compensating substance or sinking air ahead of the storm. So Elsa is a tropical storm. The big question, though, is what happens after it goes through Cuba? Does it weaken it? How much time does it spend over Cuba? And what does it end up being like when it gets on this side of Cuba out here in the Florida Straits? Let's go back to Carl Parker. Carl, that really is the question. We know we're going to have impacts here in the Keys and across the Sunshine State eventually, the Carolinas and Georgia. And remember, it doesn't take a lot of wind to knock down trees. But the bottom line is, what's left of Elsa? I mean, you look at the European and it's just kind of poo-pooing it. The GFS is a little bit stronger.
Yeah, and it's really tricky, Mike, because you've got such different scenarios where, you know, if the storm were to track a little bit more north, then it would be going over mountains that are 6,000 to 7,000 feet tall in southeast Cuba, and then maybe spending a lot more time over land. Whereas if it were a little more south, you've got it not only over the ocean, but over the ocean with very high ocean heat content. The sea surface temperature is actually in the upper 80s to 90 degrees just south of Cuba.
Yeah, our water temperature here is about 84, 85. So yes, there's plenty of energy in that water. But again, it's all about the terrain, the friction, which tears apart at these tropical systems. So what we can hope for is the friction weakens the system. It gets back into the Gulf of Mexico, and then it won't have much time to intensify. Certainly, you would agree, Carl, that the probability of this rejuvenating to back to hurricane status is on the low end of the probability chart.
Yeah, well, I hope so, Mike. You know, the tropics have really surprised me in recent years. I'll say that. You know, if the storm were to stay south of Cuba the entire time and then just have a short pass over that narrow stretch of island, you know, I would say it is possible that it gets stronger once again as it comes up towards Florida. So we've got a lot to watch, that's for sure. You know, Mike, I got to say, that's a beautiful sunset. I've spent some time in Key West. I could not get over the fact that every time we would go out to Mallory Square in the evening, the sunset was great every single night. Different and great every single night. It's pretty amazing how consistent it is down there.
Yeah, Mallory Square is great. Now, in the winter, when you go to Mallory Square, it sets to the left of the island that sits off the coast there. But this time of the year, it sets over the island. Plus, compared to last year with COVID, Mallory Square is just absolutely packed this year. Everybody try and get their photo op. So when you're over here on the south side, near the southernmost point of the country, you get a clear shot, and you don't have all the people around. So yeah, the sunsets here are worth the price of admission. But again, Monday night and Tuesday in Florida, the Keys, we have a tropical storm watch, middle and lower Keys, and no doubt they're going to be extending those watches into the peninsula probably sometime tomorrow once we get a better idea of the intensity and the exact track. Right now, the cone does include all of the Keys, but they do not have the upper Keys in a watch at this point.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. And let's take a look at the latest advisory from the National Hurricane Center. So we're talking about a 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm now moving west-northwest at 23 miles per hour. That's important because it had been moving as high as nearly 30 miles per hour earlier today, and that forward speed is slowing. And so for that reason, that is allowing the convection, the deep thunderstorms, the mid-level center to catch up with that low-level center. And that might be part of why we're seeing a big burst of thunderstorms nearer that center. You see just in the last couple of frames here, it's starting to look a lot more interesting. Huge blow up of very cold cloud tops indicated by that magenta and purple color right there. That is showing you where you've got very, very tall clouds. And when you see that, you're looking at an intensifying circulation. So we'll see if that holds. We'll see if that little burst holds. That's going to be really important to see what happens before it really starts interacting with land going into overnight and early tomorrow. So there's the forecast track. That's from the Hurricane Center, calling for a strong tropical storm to be right along the coast of Cuba or maybe just on shore. And that's everything right there. That's the whole thing. I mean, if it were to spend all this time running up and along Cuba, there might not be much of anything coming out the other side. That would be the best case scenario for the U.S., not for Cuba, because they'd be looking at some very heavy rain in that situation. They will, regardless of where it is, but certainly so in that situation. And then if it were to be a little more to the south and stay out over the open water and then just at the very last minute pass through this flatter section of Cuba, well, then you'd be dealing with a more organized storm that would then come out into the Florida Straits and towards the west coast of Florida. So right now, forecasting a strong tropical storm. That's what the Hurricane Center is forecasting, but there's a lot of different things that are on the table at this point. We're going to talk more about that coming up on the other side of the break. Stay tuned.
What happens?
Tropical storm Elsa is charging through the Caribbean right now as it heads towards Florida and then the southeastern United States. The Florida Keys are now under a tropical storm watch. Meteorologist Mike Seidel is in Key West as people anxiously await the latest tropical threat. Mike?
Yes, indeed. Big 4th of July weekend. The Keys are packed, and they're all watching Elsa to see what it's going to end up like once it gets through Cuba and into the Florida Straits. We'll check in with Carl Parker with his analysis coming up, and we'll talk impacts here in the Keys in just a few minutes. Molly?
Thanks, Mike. Here's what we know right now. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency in 15 counties today. In Surfside, Florida, rescuers suspended a search and rescue operations at the collapsed condo building this afternoon. Officials are quickly preparing for demolition ahead of the storm because strong winds could bring down the rest of the building. At least one death has been reported in St. Lucia, and 2 people were killed in the Dominican Republic after walls collapsed on them, according to the country's Emergency Operations Center. Now let's get the latest on Tropical Storm Elsa and where it's headed from storm specialist Carl Parker. Now, it's always interesting when tropical systems get in this part of the Caribbean because there's so many factors at play.
Yeah, and a lot of it is land interaction. That's going to be one of the biggest things that we're watching for over the next couple of days here, because it is going to be passing along Cuba and then right over Cuba at some point. How much time will it spend over land? What part of the land is it going to be over? There very tall mountains in southeast Cuba. Will it be close to those? And the thing spent a lot of the day today not being all that organized. That is now just starting to change a little bit. We're starting to see a little more organization, and that could have something to do with what's happened with the forward speed. For a lot of the day today, it was moving west-northwest at nearly 30 miles per hour. Now that forward speed has slowed to 23 miles per hour. And so that may be allowing the storm to become, as we say, more vertically stacked. And I'll show you that here in the satellite in just a moment. So here's the forecast track and intensities from the Hurricane Center. And what they're calling for is for the storm to interact with land, and that weakens the circulation. So it drops back to a mid-grade tropical storm at that point, then comes back out over the open water, has some time to get reorganized as it approaches the west coast of Florida. Now, keep in mind, some modeling shows a much weaker system coming off of Cuba. So that is something that's possible. But right now, what we're looking at is the potential for a strong tropical storm to come up along the west coast of Florida. And I'll tell you, if everything went just right, we certainly could even be talking about a hurricane coming up towards Florida. It looks less likely at this point, but it is a possibility and something we want to keep in mind. Now, this is what I was mentioning earlier. So pay attention to the center of circulation. Early on here, you see it's at the leading edge of all that deep convection. And so the low-level center is racing out off to the west, and then the mid-level center is trailing behind that. And so as long as that's the case, the storm is not, as we say, vertically stacked. It's not going to get more organized. But notice what happens just in the last couple of frames. That low-level center starting to slow down a little bit and probably allowing that mid-level center to catch up. So it's starting to become a little bit more vertically stacked. And that probably is a big part of why we're seeing this big blow-up, this big flare-up of thunderstorms near the center, and it's got some time. Now, there's going to be more interaction with land. It's near Hispaniola, but moving away. There's Jamaica, of course. Here are the very tall mountains in Cuba. So it's possible that it could sort of thread the needle here and then come up over the open water and have some time to continue to get a little bit more organized. And the other thing is there's very high heat content in the water in the Caribbean, south of Cuba. So, imagine that it takes the south side of this track, stays out over that very warm water, water temperatures in the middle to upper 80s, up to 90 degrees in some cases. So there's more than enough energy to keep this thing going. Or, imagine that it takes more of a northerly track. Then it gets nearer those tall mountains, spends more time over land. So in that scenario, you'd be looking at a weaker system coming off of Cuba, whereas in this scenario, you'd be looking at a stronger system just briefly passing over land and then coming up into the Gulf of Mexico. So, that's why this is a really uncertain forecast in terms of intensity. And here, by the way, is the American model, the GFS model, showing more organization as it comes up and towards the west coast of Florida there. That, of course, would mean a lot of rain and very heavy wind from the Keys all the way up into Bradenton, Sarasota, and into Tampa as well. We want to go out to Mike Seidel. He's been reporting on the storm in Key West, Florida for us. And Mike, a big holiday weekend. A lot of people getting out and about and really enjoying doing that for the first time in a long time. And here we got to keep our eyes on what's going on in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, we certainly do. And as you can imagine, 4th of July, the Keys, it is packed to the brim here with tourists. The locals are loving it after, the past year and a half of the lack of tourism with COVID. So we had another hot, sunny day here today. In fact, 91, only our third 90-degree day. Remember, it's Key West. It's not New York, where they've had over a dozen around Newark International Airport. So we're cooling off tonight or to the low 80s. As Carl mentioned, the water is warm. Skies are clear. Tomorrow's not an issue. The issue is what happens, as Carl mentioned, with Elsa once it gets across Cuba. How much of Cuba impacts Elsa, and that determines basically what kind of storm we have on the other side in the Florida Straits and what kind of storm we have as it comes through the Keys, primarily the middle and lower Keys right now under that tropical storm watch with the impacts of rain and wind on Monday. So take a look at what we've got as far as the forecast. We're talking winds picking up. Monday is the day. Monday afternoon to Tuesday morning. Sustained winds as high as 30 to 35 miles an hour. They could be stronger. Again, this is based on our current track forecast, and gust easily over 40 miles an hour and plenty of rain. That's pretty much a given, whether it's a weaker system or a stronger system. We've seen tropical depressions drop 3 feet of rain. So the rainfall is a given. We may even have some spin-ups here because they're going to be on the right side or the left side of the circulation. That's what's expected. Meanwhile, we've talked to some locals who have been through many, many storms, including Irma, which was the bad one, the most recent bad one just 4 years ago, about what they're planning ahead of Elsa.
Tropical storm Elsa is on its way. Have you been preparing?
Yes, we always prepare when there's hurricanes or storms coming. We already have the non-perishable items, the water, normal batteries, all that stuff.
Good idea. Always be prepared because you just don't know what's going to happen. A tropical storm is what we're expecting. We could have a hurricane, but again, Lorraine is doing the right thing. Have your hurricane kit in place. Gulf Coast, East Coast. I know last year the East Coast was spared most of the action. The Gulf Coast got hammered, but this time around, Carl, it is likely going to be the East Coast, or the West Coast of Florida, then the Southeast Coast of the United States as we get into middle of next week with wind and rain up to the Outer Banks at this point. That's the forecast track.
And Mike, as you know well, when we see a little more model convergence, which is to say models sort of in the same camp about what is going to happen, we have more confidence in the forecast. And, that really is not what we have seen in this case. You look at the HWARF, for example, that model tends to run a little bit hot, but it was showing a really strong system coming up to the west coast of Florida just yesterday. And, now it really has backed off of that. So we're seeing a lot of movement, from one scenario to another in the model guidance.
Well, remember the GFS was forecasting a hurricane since last Sunday.
Yeah.
Since last Sunday, and it blinked yesterday and started bringing a system up the west coast, but in a weaker fashion, in a pressure more along a tropical storm pressure, like 1,004, 1,005 millibars. So it blinked. European has never had much of a system coming across and up the west coast of Florida. In fact, the morning run basically washed it out and didn't even have a closed isobar and didn't have another closed isobar until it took it across Florida and off the Carolina coast by about Wednesday of next week. So you've got these different models, but as you mentioned, yes, the HWARF, which usually is very bullish, has backed off. The GFS backed off yesterday to a tropical storm. European washes it out. So again, the suspense continues here in the Keys and for many in Florida and even the Carolinas to see what we end up with. This time tomorrow we'll have a much better idea of what Cuba does to it and what the overall atmosphere does to Elsa's circulation as it leaves Cuba, comes up through the Florida Straits and up towards the Keys. Again, our most vulnerable time will be later Monday here in Key West, the lower Keys, through Tuesday morning.
Yeah, Mike, you like to see a little consistency from model to model and then from run to run within the models, and we certainly have not seen that in this case. Mike, thank you so much, and let's talk a little bit more about what some of these models are showing us now. And so when we look at the American model, which is one of the models that's, a little bit more aggressive about the idea of the storm becoming, reorganizing essentially as it comes off the coast of Florida. What this model is showing us is that there could be some pretty strong wind coming into South Florida. So there's a look at Monday night's forecast, 40 to 50 mile per hour wind gusts in Key West. And then we take it into Tuesday and we see that strong wind coming up into Tampa by the time we get into Tuesday night. So in that scenario, you've got a stronger area of low pressure that is, really developing as it's sitting out over the Gulf of Mexico. But as Mike mentioned, European model, very strong model, is showing a really very different scenario. Not much wind at all. Still a lot of moisture, a lot of rain coming up, but not much wind at all. So, there's still some really big questions in terms of this forecast. It's a pretty uncertain forecast as regards intensity, which, is the main thing that we look for in tropical systems in terms of the impacts for wind and surge. However, you're going to be getting some heavy rain no matter what. So tropical storm watch is in effect in the lower Keys. Here, by the way, is the European ensemble tracks. And so this guidance has narrowed a little bit in the last couple of days. So a little more confidence about the idea of the storm generally coming towards the west coast of Florida. And when we look at the current guidance for intensity, we see some models kind of flirting with hurricane intensity. They're right at the envelope there. They're right on the north edge of this envelope, showing that you've got some chance for some intensification early on. But then in the longer term, all of this guidance is at tropical storm intensity and even lower than that. So, that really is the question going forward. What are we going to be looking at coming off of Cuba? And we've got a day or so to figure that out. Molly, over to you.
A lot of questions still to answer. Well, much of South Florida's Atlantic coastline is outside of the forecast cone for Elsa. However, that doesn't mean cities like Fort Lauderdale and Miami are in the clear. These are live pictures now from Fort Lauderdale. The Florida governor today declared a state of emergency for 15 counties across the state. Fort Lauderdale is not part of that executive order. However, the governor said he may alter it as Elsa's path becomes clear. Let's talk about this because we are seeing some model divergence. You just heard Carl talk about this. This is the European model as far as the rainfall expected as Elsa starts to move in. Tuesday through Thursday, you can see a small footprint right across Florida and then with the heavy rain staying off in the Atlantic. But the American model paints a very different picture. A more intense Elsa moving in right along the coast, bringing some heavy rain from Key West all the way through Fort Myers, up through Sarasota, the Tampa area, Clearwater, where we could see 5 to 8 inches of rain. But it's not just the Gulf Coast of Florida. Check out the coast of Georgia up into the Carolinas. If we see this cross over Florida and move up the coast of Georgia into South and North Carolina, this could tap into some very warm water in the Gulf Stream, and we could see some very heavy rainfall. And these are many areas that just finished the week with some very heavy rainfall thanks to a front moving through. Really don't need any more rain. Let's zone in on Tampa, and that's where we could see anywhere from 1 to 2 inches of rain as Elsa starts to move in. But it's not just the rain in Tampa. Tampa could be greeting Elsa head on, where we could see 35 to even 40 mile per hour winds. That's Tuesday into Tuesday night before things really start to calm down Wednesday into Wednesday night. A little bit farther down to the south, Fort Myers, Sanibel, Captiva Islands, Naples, all the way down into Miami. Not a lot of rain in Miami, but anything will be not welcome as the search and rescue efforts continue in Surfside. The wind not too strong in Miami. We could see that rain starting as early as Monday night and continuing through Tuesday. Fort Myers also seeing some of those gusty winds starting Tuesday night. You see that right there, where we could see 30 to 35 mile per hour winds. Carl?
Well, a slow-moving front stretching from Texas to South Georgia is dumping a lot of rain on parts of the South and Gulf Coast states. Here's a look at Midland, Texas, in the western part of the state, where the summers are usually very dry and very hot. But you do begin to see a little more moisture flowing in as we get deep into the summer. Wow, just a really impressive lightning there. Fierce storms a lot of times in the western part of Texas. So let's take a look at what's going on the radar right now. And we've got showers and storms along the I-10 corridor. A couple of flash flood warnings to tell you about. Lafayette, St. Martin parishes under warning until 10:15. And then another one here in the Beaumont area, that's Orange County under warning, and that is going until 9 o'clock. There has been a crazy amount of rain in the last couple of days. All those areas in yellow are where we've seen 3 to 4 to 5 inches of rain. So it has been exceptionally wet on either side of I-10 in Texas and Louisiana. You've got this front that has come down, cooled things off, dried it out a little bit in the southeast. Very pleasant right now for a lot of you, but along the Gulf Coast, not so much. And you see that moisture, that deep tropical moisture surging back and back up into the Gulf Coast. So we've got plenty of scattered storms on the way for the I-10 corridor, much of the Lone Star State, and then the wet weather starting to come into Florida, of course, courtesy of our tropical storm. We'll have much more on that coming up in a moment.
What happens when you make power your thing?
Evacuate immediately.
Oh no. Go, go! I'm on!
Welcome back. The hurricane hunters have been busy getting data from Tropical Storm Elsa. This is video from one of NOAA's hurricane hunter planes known as Kermit. You can see all that deep tropical moisture there, very buoyant atmosphere, a lot of different clouds at different layers of the atmosphere, very tropical sky there. And the U.S. Air Force hurricane hunters are flying into the system right now, so we should have a pretty good sense of what is going on right now. We're actually seeing a little bit of a resurgence of convection or thunderstorms near the center of circulation. So here's the path of the Air Force Hurricane Hunters flight. They've just gone down just ahead of the center. Looks like they're going to be crossing back across what might be the center right now. And so you see what's happened here over the last 6 hours, and you notice that we have seen and actually a longer period than that, 12 hours, you notice that we have seen kind of a resurgence, as I mentioned, of convection. It was really kind of struggling through a lot of the middle of the day today, some interaction with land in Hispaniola, and the low-level center was out ahead of where all the thunderstorms are. So, you know, if that's not co-located, then you're not going to see a strengthening tropical cyclone. But that may be changing now because the low-level center is starting to slow down a little bit. And you notice there's been this big burst of convection just in the last couple of hours. So it appears to be trying to get a little more organized right now. Now the hurricane hunters, and look at that, they just made a pass around the front, and now just more recently getting up into strong mid-grade tropical storm winds, tropical storm force winds. So they're coming across the center now, and they're going to do that several times and get a really good sense of what's going on with the wind in the storm. It's amazing how accurate these devices are, but they've got a device that tracks the sea floor as they're going along, and it tracks the sea spray that is coming up from the ocean. It's amazing. It can be accurate to within 10%, and it's tracking the amount of sea spray that's coming up from the ocean, how agitated the ocean is, and it's a very, very good way to tell how much wind there is. And so that's what they're doing right now. They're scanning the sea floor, and as they continue to come across the center part of the storm several times, we'll get a really good sense of exactly what kind of a storm we're dealing with and whether or not it is strengthening. And they're going to continue to do this on a regular schedule, going again tomorrow afternoon, and Monday morning as well. Molly, over to you.
Thanks, Carl. Well, it takes a lot of tools to get accurate measurements of tropical storms and hurricanes. We got a look inside a very special aircraft used by the hurricane hunters out of Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi.
Hi, I'm Devin Meister with the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron. Going to take you on a tour of our plane. This is a WC-130J, which means it's W is weather modified. This is where our weather officer sits, and he or she is talking with Karka. Karka is our liaison to the National Hurricane Center. And this is where our loadmaster sits, and our loadmaster works in coordination with our weather officer on where exactly we do our drops. And these are the drop sondes that are launched through our drop tube, and we're collecting wind speed, wind direction, temperature, and pressure. What's very challenging is that you're flying through essentially a band of thunderstorms, and you have to mitigate that while you're flying through it. Up here is our flight deck, and we have 2 pilots and a navigator that sits up here. And our navigator is in constant coordination with our weather officer about where the National Hurricane Center wants us to go within the storm. And the navigator has the job of keeping us safe and keeping us away from the most dangerous parts of the storm, which we try to avoid but can't always. We have a very different type of mission to protect the United States and United States assets. It just so happens we fly into hurricanes instead of combat.
Well, here's a live look at Miami right now. You can see a few of those clouds, but overall, pretty nice night. While the latest forecast track takes Miami out of the cone, you're not exactly in the clear either. So, Carl, if they're not in the cone, which is pretty typical when you get tropical systems, you can feel impacts well outside the cone and never get married exactly to where the cone is, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, we've said this many, many times, but a forecast cone is not an impacts cone. So it does not mean that if you're not in the cone, you're probably not going to get much, or if you're in the cone, you're probably going to get the weather. That's not what the cone means. The cone rather is derived from the forecast errors at different forecast points. And so when the hurricane forecasters at the National Hurricane Center are making a forecast, first of all, they're looking at all the model guidance. They're putting all of that together to come up with their best forecast based on all that guidance going out for these different periods. Then once they've done that, they apply the average forecast error to each of those points. Now, the average forecast error has been getting smaller and smaller over many years, and so that's the good news, but it's still pretty big as you go out, farther in time. And so that's why the cone gets wider and wider, because the average forecast error increases as you go out farther in time. Now, based on that, you're looking at, where you're likely to see impacts right down the center line of the cone. That's the best guess. But still, there are times when the storm ends up going outside of the actual cone. In fact, the storm stays within the cone about 2/3 of the time. So a third of the time, the center of the storm is actually outside of the cone. And so that's really important to keep in mind, that it's not whether you're in or out of the cone, but whether you're near it.
What happened?
Good evening. Welcome back to Key West. I'm meteorologist Mike Seidel. Another beautiful evening in paradise, but we're all watching Elsa. The Keys, as you can imagine, all the beaches in America basically are packed, especially after last year. There are thousands in the Keys. No evacuation orders. There's a state of emergency, and we do have a tropical storm watch for the middle and lower Keys, not for the upper Keys at this point. That could be extended up to Key Largo and then up the west coast of Florida, or even the east coast of Florida. We're not sure. Track is not etched in stone, and now we're still watching where it is just south of Cuba. In fact, I've been watching the skies, and I've seen some flashes of lightning. These storms are about 150 miles away. Gives you an idea of how the lightning bounces off the higher levels of the atmosphere, the flash of light. Meanwhile, today we found that the water was fine, 84 degrees. The sun was out. Look at the beaches this morning. This is late morning. I shot this video, and just another gorgeous day. 91 today, their third 90-degree day, and overnight lows are averaging around 80. So it's typical tropical weather. The water is warm, and that's our concern. There's a lot of heat content in the ocean. There are also a lot of people in town, as I mentioned, and we ran into a guy named Anthony talking about his concerns as Elsa approaches on Monday.
What is your biggest worry for Tropical Storm Elsa?
Not being able to get back to New York. But I mean, it could be worse. You could be stuck in Key West.
So New York just had a ton of heat. How are you dealing with the heat down here?
It's not as bad. New York, we at least get a breeze here. New York was very still for a little bit, but other than that, it's okay. We're still sweating. Got to change the shirt a few times.
Well, think about this. Newark International Airport there in the tri-state has hit 102 twice. Today, 91 is the hottest day they've had all summer. So you put it in perspective, 10 degrees cooler, you got a breeze, and you got the ocean. So, yes, there is something to be said about being in the Keys, although they have not gone below 70 here in Key West for over 3 months at this point, and they may not drop below 70 till October, November. Meanwhile, back to the story at hand, Elsa and the track and the cone going over and to the west of Key West. You don't want to center your eyeball right on the center of the track because the impacts occur away from the center, and the wind and rain will be certainly felt outside of the cone. The bottom line right now, again, is what are we going to have tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon, Molly, after the center emerges from whatever it tracks or how much it tracks over Cuba and the terrain and the friction to see what kind of system we have going into Sunday night and Monday, how strong it's going to be as it gets up here. But right now we're expecting a tropical storm through the Keys and the west coast of Florida the early part of next week.
Thanks, Mike. Here's what we know right now. Tropical storm Elsa. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency in 15 counties today. Elsa is now blamed for at least 3 deaths in the Caribbean, 1 in St. Lucia. 2 people were killed in the Dominican Republic when walls collapsed on them. Barbados was also hit hard by Elsa. More than 1,000 people reported damaged homes, including 62 that completely collapsed. Now let's find out the latest on where Elsa is heading from storm specialist Carl Parker. Let's bring Carl in. And this is not just going to be a system for Florida. I know all eyes are on Florida right now, but this is going to potentially cross over Florida and bring a lot of rain to areas like Georgia and the Carolinas that just got through with seeing some really heavy rain.
Yeah, and so, that's where, what it is going to have a huge impact on what people see farther downstream. And, that is really the million-dollar question right now. What are we going to be looking at coming off of Cuba? And this is always an issue with storms that are coming through the Caribbean. How much interaction with land is there going to be with Cuba? So what is it going to be as it moves off of Cuba and towards Florida? Some of the model guidance indicating that it might not do that much. It might end up being really weakened by that time, but we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence right now, so certainly it's a thorny question. Here you see the forecast from the Hurricane Center looking for a strong tropical storm to either be right along the coast of Cuba or maybe just south, and then coming across Cuba for a time. It's flatter on the western end of the island, so a little less impact there if that's the area where it crosses, and then it comes out into the Gulf most likely and moves up towards western Florida. Possibly it's a strong tropical storm, but I wouldn't say that it's not possible for us to get a hurricane in Florida at this point. It all depends on what happens here over the next couple of days. If it's pretty well organized and it stays for the most part just south of Cuba and then just crosses in a narrow part of the island, the northwest part of the island, well, then we could be talking about something really different coming up through the Gulf. And notice here, big burst of thunderstorms nearer that center. The low-level center has been kind of racing away from the storm for a lot of the day today. That's a big part of why it's been so disorganized. That's beginning to change a little bit. And for that reason, it's looking more and more healthy, and we'll talk much more about the impacts coming up.
Okay.
Wow, listen to that. That is Hurricane Elsa crossing across the eastern part of the Caribbean, the Lesser Antilles, surging past the Windward Islands and leaving behind a trail of destroyed and damaged buildings. Very strong winds whipping through the yard yesterday, and fortunately no reports of any deaths here in Barbados. But a dangerous storm, and one that's been struggling for a lot of the day today because it's been sheared. We often talk about wind shear having a negative impact. I think that is lessening some at this hour, so it's getting a little bit more organized. The hurricane hunters are in the system right now. The winds they've found thus far have not been that strong, and there is a little bit of a lag between the time that you see the thunderstorms becoming more organized and the winds responding to that. So again, it's been disorganized for a lot of the day today, and the winds responded to that. Now, however, we're seeing a burst of thunderstorms near that center, and so I think the winds are probably going to respond to that as well. So right now, forecast to be a strong tropical storm as it either passes right along the southern coast of Cuba or maybe works on shore. That's going to have everything to do with everything. If it spends a long time basically running up the spine of Cuba, well, that could really tear up the storm. I mean, it happens often that you see storms passing over Hispaniola and Cuba, and by the time they come out, there's nothing left of them. So that's a possibility in this case. On the other hand, if the storm were to stay south of Cuba and stay out over the open water and then just pass over Cuba in this very narrow section and then have a lot of time out of the Gulf of Mexico, well, it could re-strengthen, and we might even be talking about a hurricane once again. So there's a really wide range of possibilities at this point. There you see the what's been showing up in the satellite today, where that low-level center was out ahead of the mid-level center for a lot of the day, and that's finally now starting to change a little bit. It's becoming a little more vertically stacked, and so we see this big blow-up of thunderstorms as a result. Let's talk about the model forecast and show you the GFS, the American model forecast. And you notice here a low-level center that's right in there. A lot of heavy rain in Cuba, so that is going to be the more immediate concern. Flash flooding, mudslides in Cuba, and some strong wind as well. And then as the center crosses, perhaps it comes out into the Gulf and gets more organized. But again, not all the models are in that camp. And they've been back and forth over the last couple of days. So a lot to sort out with this storm. Molly, over to you.
Thanks, Carl. Well, just outside of Miami in Surfside, crews have suspended this search and rescue efforts at the condo that collapsed last month. With Tropical Storm Elsa bearing down on South Florida, officials have decided to demolish the rest of the condo towers. That could happen as soon as tomorrow.
The governor and I sat in a meeting, and it was obvious that the building was a problem, and we agreed that the only solution for that problem was to eliminate it. We voiced those concerns to Mayor Cava, who went back and took decisive action, and instead of waiting weeks and allowing the bureaucracy to crawl, has made a very dramatic decision and signed the order to get this building taken down immediately. The fear was that the hurricane may take the building down for us and take it down in the wrong direction, on top of the pile where we have victims. I congratulate Mayor Cava for her decisive leadership in making this happen, I think as early as tomorrow, and that will allow our rescue workers to pour all over the entire site without fear of any danger from falling debris or falling buildings.
Well, time is running out for demolition crews to bring down the rest of the condo tower. We want to bring in storm specialist Carl Parker. And let's talk about the weather in Miami, not only for tomorrow, but in the extended forecast, because very, very close to where we expect Elsa to track.
Yeah, so, there's going to be plenty of heavy rain coming through at a minimum, and certainly there could be some gusty wind as well, depending on exactly what the storm looks like as it's approaching southwest Florida. Here's one model solution, and so we'll take this through tonight and then into tomorrow. For the most part, it is quieter tomorrow in South Florida, but then on Monday we start seeing these waves of storms coming through, and it may not happen exactly like that, but it's meant to give you the idea. It is certainly not going to be optimal for the ongoing search efforts there in South Florida. So there you see scattered storms on Monday. By Monday night, the rain becomes a little more insistent, and that continues into Tuesday as well, about 86 for the high on Tuesday. Well, another big story we're following tonight is the dangerous and deadly heat wave in the west. Here's Molly with more on that.
It's still hot in the west, Carl. We want to take you out to where we're seeing heat advisories and excessive heat warnings for much of the west. And that does include the Columbia Basin in Washington, excessive heat warning along the Snake River in Idaho, over into the Boise area, where we could see temperatures in the 90s and triple digits. And the heat is just going to continue to build in. We've got the jet stream way to the north, and that dominant high pressure still in place. That's only going to strengthen and build, and you've got that sinking, compressing air underneath that's going to heat up very efficiently. That's going to lead to widespread temperatures 10 to 20 degrees above average all the way across the west. So we're talking about 90s, 100s, and that's going to continue for many areas like Salt Lake, Boise, over into Salem. Let's zone in on Portland. Portland, you just got off breaking that all-time record up to 116. It's not going to be that hot, but you're still well above your average. Take a look at that. Your average high, 79 degrees. You're not going to be anywhere close to that with the exception of Wednesday. Other than that, you'll be in the upper 80s and 90s for the foreseeable future. And it's not just the heat. We've got active wildfires pretty much all across the west. This is 47 active wildfires. You have to be so careful. 4th of July holiday coming up. A lot of areas are banning fireworks, so make sure you pay close attention to those bans. We're still tracking Tropical Storm Elsa moving across the Caribbean right now. The big question is, where will it move across Cuba, and if it will weaken as it moves across Cuba?
Good morning.
Welcome back to our special coverage of Tropical Storm Elsa, which is now southeast of Cuba, coming up towards the Florida Keys, most likely on Monday, and then towards the west coast of Florida. That does not, however, mean that South Florida is off the hook. Quite the opposite. At a minimum, we're going to be looking at some heavy rain and perhaps some fairly gusty wind as well, depending on precisely what the nature of this storm is as it comes up towards Florida. So right now, it's 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm. The hurricane hunters have been out flying in the system. Thus far, they've only found winds of about 63 miles per hour. So we'll see what happens in the next advisory. It's been interesting to watch because the storm has been really disorganized for a lot of the day today. And so I think the winds responded to that. And just within the last couple of hours, we've seen a burst of thunderstorms near the center of circulation. And so perhaps the winds get a little bit stronger later tonight as a result of that. But we may not know that because the hurricane hunters are only out in the system for so long. So here's the forecast track and intensities from the Hurricane Center. Looking for a strong tropical storm to come up near or along the coast of Cuba and then eventually cross Cuba, come into the Florida Straits, and then into the eastern Gulf of Mexico, the west coast of Florida, and at that point could be redeveloping at that time. Now, again, you see there's been this really big burst of thunderstorms, and part of what was going on today is that the low-level center was displaced from all the thunderstorm activity, and when that happens, when it's displaced like that, it's not vertically stacked, as we say. It's just not going to, get any more intense. That could be changing now because the low-level center slowed down, so the rest of the storm may be catching up with that low-level center. And certainly we're seeing a very impressive bursting of thunderstorms near that center. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens overnight tonight. And oftentimes in the overnight hours, you actually do see more development of thunderstorms. The instability actually increases at night, sort of the opposite of what we see over land as the water stays very warm. And so the atmosphere just above the water in the boundary layer, as we say, also stays very warm. Now, here's the issue in a nutshell. You've got very warm ocean waters with a very high heat content south of Cuba. And then in Cuba, right there in South Cuba, you've got mountains that are 6,500 feet high. And then you've got this long stretch of land. So does the storm start tangling with these very tall mountains and then basically run up along the coastline and then stay over land for a long period of time? If it were to happen like that, there might not be much of a storm coming out the other end, north of Cuba. Or does it stay south of Cuba? Does it stay out over the open water in this water that is 85 to 90 degrees, in which case it could be more organized and then just cross a tiny little section of Cuba before it goes into the Florida Straits? That is the forecast intensity issue here over the next 24 hours. And, you know, once we have a better handle on what's happening with the storm during that time, we'll have a much better idea of what it is that is going to be coming up to Florida. Molly, over to you.
Well, Elsa hit the Caribbean island of Barbados as a Category 1 hurricane. Let's take a look at some of the damage. The storm damaged several homes, knocked down trees, knocked out power and water to many parts of the island, but there were no reports of serious injuries or deaths. Elsa is the first hurricane to hit Barbados in over 60 years. And here's a look at more damage from Elsa in Foul Bay, Barbados. Strong winds ripped off the roof of this building, and wow, I mean, that's some strong winds that came through. You can even see did some damage to the windows there with the beach just right outside the window. And here's a look at some of this storm surge and wind and rain that Elsa brought to Barbados. You can see it whipping up the seas, bringing some big waves on shore with those really strong winds. And Elsa really was the strongest so far as it moved through Barbados with those peak winds measuring on the island 86 miles per hour. So that's a look at what Elsa did while it was a hurricane. It has since been downgraded to a tropical storm, and there's something else that could protect parts of the U.S. from Elsa's wrath, and that is Cuba. You've heard us talk about Cuba a lot tonight. Carl, we want to bring in Carl Storm Specialist Carl Parker, and with Cuba, the question is really where across Cuba is it going to move? Because you've got some really high terrain to the southeast, and even at its widest point, Cuba is about, I think, 119 miles wide. So you're not talking about a wide stretch of land. It's going to be the terrain that's the question.
The terrain, and then also, you know, how much time it spends over or near land as well, because it's kind of running up and along Cuba. And so if it spends a long time over Cuba or very close to it, that certainly is going to have a huge impact on the system. Now, in the southeast part of Cuba in particular, that's where you've got mountains that are 6,500 feet high. And when you've got a lot of high terrain like that, that can disrupt a tropical cyclone. For one thing, the air tends to be a little drier around those mountains, and so that is part of the air that is getting into the circulation. And for another, it's just disrupting the circulation in general. So, you know, if the storm were to pass right over those mountains, then that obviously would have a big impact. Doesn't look like that's going to be the case. But another thing that's been going on today is that the system has been sheared, where the low-level center got out ahead of the mid-level center and where all the convection was. And so when you see that sort of displacement like that, you tend to see a weakening trend, but that could be turning around right now. And in fact, as we look at the satellite picture, we're seeing what appears to be more organization, a big blow up of thunderstorms about that center. We're going to talk more about all the potential impacts coming up here in just a moment.
Elsa is charging through the Caribbean right now as it heads towards Florida and the southeastern U.S. The Florida Keys now under a tropical storm watch, and that is the middle and lower Keys that are under that tropical storm watch. We have some of the latest and what we know right now on Tropical Storm Elsa. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency in 15 counties today. In Surfside, Florida, rescuers suspended the search and rescue operations at the collapsed condo building this afternoon. Officials are quickly preparing for demolition ahead of the storm because strong winds could bring down the rest of the building. And at least one death has been reported in St. Lucia, and 2 more people were killed in the Dominican Republic after walls collapsed on them, according to the country's Emergency Operations Center. Let's get the latest on Elsa and where it is headed from storm specialist Carl Parker. So we've seen kind of a ragged appearance on satellite all throughout the day, but now as the sun is setting and already set in many areas, we're starting to see Elsa start to put a little bit of a show on satellite with some convection happening.
Yeah, it's been really interesting because it was on the ropes for a lot of the day today, and now that's changing a little bit. I think it's being a little less sheared relative to what we saw earlier. I'll show you what that looked like on the satellite loop here. So right now it is a 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm. It is moving west-northwest at 23 miles per hour. That's an important part to the puzzle here because it was racing earlier today at about 30 miles per hour. That low-level center has slowed down, and that's now allowing the thunderstorms to catch up with the center. And it's now passing just south of Haiti. It's still got some time out over the open water before it really starts to tangle with Cuba. And that is the big question, just how much is it going to be overland in Cuba? We know Cuba, by the way, is going to get hit very hard by flooding and landslides, some wind as well. But that interaction with Cuba is going to have a lot to do with what exactly comes out on the other side. So the best guess from the Hurricane Center right now is that we're going to be looking at a strong tropical storm, 65-mile-per-hour tropical storm, but that is not very far away from being a hurricane. So it's entirely possible that if everything happened optimally for the storm, stayed over the open water for a long period of time, it's entirely possible that we could be looking at a hurricane coming up towards western Florida. So here's a satellite picture. Notice how if you follow that low-level center, which is right there, if you follow that along, a lot of the thunderstorms were following it for the better part of the day today. So you had the low-level center and then a mid-level center with the thunderstorms behind it. And it's kind of disjointed like this. And that was what was going on for a lot of the day. As long as that's the case, it's not going to get more organized. It's not going to get stronger. That is what we call not vertically stacked when it's like that, when you've got this dislocation between those centers. Well, now that the low-level center is slowing down, I think that has allowed the mid-level center to start to catch up. And now if it's becoming a little bit more vertically stacked, well, it can become more organized. And we're seeing this big blow-up of thunderstorms near the center. And by the way, right at the time when we tend to see more thunderstorm activity at night, you have more instability because you've got very warm air near the ocean surface, but the upstairs is cooling off at the same time. So the instability actually increases overnight. And oftentimes we see an overnight burst of thunderstorms. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see what is coming up towards Cuba, first of all, and then how close to Cuba it gets after that. It's got some time. If you look out ahead of it here, it's got some time out over the open water in which it really could get a lot more organized overnight tonight. And there you see, again, this big bursting of thunderstorms that is occurring right now. So, this is the big question. Does it take more of a northerly track? In which case it gets close to these mountains in southeast Cuba, which are as high as 6,500 feet. So that certainly would disrupt the circulation. Then does it spend a lot of time very close to or over land in Cuba, in which case that too would disrupt the circulation, and some of the modeling indicating that there might not be much of anything coming out on the other side here and up into the Florida Straits. Or does it stay south of Cuba for a long, long time and then just cross this tiny little part which is flatter and so wouldn't have much of an impact and then come out into the Florida Straits? So, those are a couple of different scenarios, or obviously it could be something in between that. And, that is what we're going to be watching over the next 24 hours. So here's the American model showing a system that's not terribly well organized and a lot of heavy rain in Cuba. That is Monday morning. Then we go into Monday evening, and we're starting to see some more organization to that system. Very heavy rain coming up into southwest Florida, into Sarasota and Bradenton, and then coming into the west coast of Florida as well. And then the storm beyond that, moving up into Georgia and South Carolina. But, again, you've got a wide array of possibilities on the table at this point. Anywhere from a weak system and a rainmaker to a strong tropical storm and more wind and surge impact along with heavy rain to possibly even a hurricane coming up and into the west coast of Florida. Well, 15 counties in Florida now under a state of emergency in preparation for possible storm surge, heavy rain, flash flooding, and strong winds from Elsa. You're looking at live pictures from Tampa, which is included in the declaration. Governor Ron DeSantis issuing the executive order this morning to allow emergency management to prepare. All right, so let's take a look at the forecast going forward and talk about some of the alerts that are now up here. There is a tropical storm watch in effect, and that for the Dry Tortugas as well as the lower Keys, including Key West. So those are the areas where we could be looking at possible tropical storm force wind coming in. And these are the probability, this is the probability of tropical storm force winds. And you see where the center of that is. So comes across Cuba, across Key West there, and then towards the west coast of Florida. Right now, the probabilities are a little lower. That changes as you get closer in time to the event. And again, it's going to have everything to do with what exactly is coming off of the north coast of Cuba. Is it a low-grade tropical storm? Is it a strong tropical storm? You know, where along the spectrum is it? That's going to have a huge impact in terms of how much wind we see in Florida. So the earliest arrival, or rather the likely arrival time for those tropical storm force winds, the Keys there coming in during the middle of the day on Monday, and then likely coming in during the middle of the day on Tuesday for the west coast of Florida. So we've got a lot of weather on the way. At a minimum, it's going to be heavy rain and some gusty wind. And, you know, Molly, really the question at this point is just how much of that do we see and what happens here in the next 24 hours?
Certainly, and the intensity is going to answer a lot of those questions as we see this move over Cuba. I do want to talk about the rainfall because always with tropical systems, the rainfall is a big concern. This is the European model, and I want you to keep in mind that the European model completely washes this out over Cuba. It's very different from the American model right now, but this leaves a footprint of heavy rain from Key West up through the Fort Myers area and then crosses into the Atlantic, keeping a lot of the heavy rain off the coast of Georgia as well as the Carolinas. Here's the American model. As I mentioned, a completely different picture where this becomes an eastern loaded side storm where we've got a lot of moisture from Tampa, Clearwater, Sarasota, all the way through Fort Myers and down into the Keys where we could see 5 to 8 inches of rain. This paints a more intense picture where we could see some strong winds in the picture as well, and that certainly would bring more concerns as far as trees and some damage. So we're zoning into Tampa, about 1 inch of rainfall. This is through the Wednesday evening time frame. The other good news with this storm is that it is moving fairly quickly, and when you see these quicker moving storms, they have less time to drop some of that really intense rainfall as opposed to the slower moving storms. So Tampa, you will see some rain. You will also see some extremely gusty winds. Look at this, Tuesday into Tuesday night where you could see 35 to 40 mile per hour winds. That's sustained. We're not talking about those wind gusts there. You could see some gusts there a little bit higher. Moving down into the southern half of Florida, Miami, about 1 inch of rain. Over into Fort Myers, looking at about close to 2 inches of rain. In Miami, the wind gusts a little bit lower, thank goodness, but the rainfall continuing Monday night all the way through Tuesday and potentially even into Tuesday night. But Miami, you are close enough to the cone. I know you're not in it right now, but you can't get married to that cone when it comes to tropical systems because we could see a little bit of a wobble to the east, and that would bring you right back into the cone. Fort Myers, Florida, also seeing some of those really gusty winds Tuesday into Tuesday night, 30 to 35 miles per hour. Again, we love to say this time of year because it's so important, but there is no such thing as just a tropical storm. You always have to be prepared. So when hurricanes or other severe storms threaten communities, having that emergency supply kit ready to go can make all of the difference. And here's a look at what you should have in yours.
Hurricane preparedness can save your life. By having a few items on hand in advance, you can make a hurricane survival kit. First, get a plastic tub or large container that can also fit in your car in case you have to evacuate. Get plenty of non-perishable foods. Make sure you have a 3-day supply for evacuation, 2-week supply for home. You will need bottled water, at least a gallon per person per day. Have an updated first aid kit on hand. And pack LED flashlights, and don't forget the fresh batteries. Have your cell phones charged, and if you can, bring an extra charger. And make sure you go to an ATM in advance to grab some cash. If the power is out, you won't be able to use your debit or credit card. Having a small gas container will come in handy if you run low on fuel for your vehicle or if you have a generator. If you do decide to run a generator, please do not run it inside your house. Generators emit a deadly amount of carbon monoxide. When finding a position for your generator, it is crucial that the area is dry, well ventilated, level, and away from your home.
Well, even without a tropical storm, parts of the Gulf Coast are already dealing with a lot of heavy rain. There you see New Orleans, a wonderful city. I really enjoy visiting New Orleans. So much character, and it can get really, really wet there, obviously being right next to the Gulf of Mexico. And we've had a lot of rain across southern Louisiana today. Let's take a look at the current radar picture. A lot of that is now sliding off to the south. Also, you don't need a hurricane to generate very strong winds. Check out the Birmingham Barons ground crew as they tried to cover the field during a thunderstorm on Wednesday night. Wind lifting up the tarp, and it sends the head groundskeeper sprawling across what amounts to a very expensive slip and slide. Look at that, isn't that something? Wow, thankfully he was not hurt, but yeah, you can certainly get some intense winds from severe local storms as well. And that's the question, are we going to be looking at a wind like that along the west coast of Florida? Still a lot to sort out in the forecast. So talking about the rainfall along the Gulf Coast, it is beginning to wind down. It's now sagging off to the south. There's an ongoing flash flood warning for Lafayette and St. Martin parishes, but the rain has moved out. Things also improving in the Beaumont area right now. But you see how much rain has come down in the last couple of days. I mean, it has been staggering. Widespread areas of 3 to 4 to 5 inches of rain indicated by that yellow shading there. And, you know, that's because of this front that dropped down into the southeast. And a lot of the south, it's actually really comfortable. The dew points have come down. It feels a little nicer outside because of that front. And you're seeing the northerly wind there in many parts of the southeast. But along the Gulf Coast, you've still got plenty of moisture. This is showing you the what's called precipitable water. It's the total amount of moisture in the atmosphere, and you know where you've got those orange and red areas, there's a lot of that, and that's going to surge back northward, so it's going to be pretty wet over the next couple of days. So here's your forecast for tomorrow. Scattered storms in Texas and along the Gulf Coast. We find more of that going into Monday as well, and then more of that going into Tuesday. Of course, the big question mark is what exactly are we going to be dealing with along the west coast of Florida? Is it going to be a strong storm? Is it going to be something less than that? What we're looking at right now is a strong tropical storm, a 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm. That is the latest as of the 8 p.m. advisory. The hurricane hunters are out in the system right now, and so far they haven't even found winds that strong. The highest that we've seen are winds of 63 miles per hour, which is not a real big surprise given what it did for a lot of the day today. It spent a lot of the day really struggling. There wasn't much to it for much of the day, but just in the last couple of hours, there's been this burst of thunderstorms nearer the center, so it appears to be getting a little bit more organized. We'll see if that holds through the overnight tonight. So the forecast track from the Hurricane Center calling for a strong tropical storm to pass either right along the coast of Cuba, maybe just south, and then maybe farther inland as well. That is going to make all the difference in the world. A track like this coming across Cuba for a long period of time, I mean, that's many hours over land. A track like that could mean that there's not much left of the system as it approaches Florida. So, that obviously is the most favorable outcome for us, not so much for Cuba because it's going to mean a lot of heavy rain for them. A track like this keeps the storm out over the open water, and then it finally just crosses a tiny little bit of Cuba right at the very end. And so it's got all of that time to continue to remain more organized, and then it comes out into the Gulf and, perhaps as a strong tropical storm. But, that's not very far away from being a hurricane. So in that optimal track for the storm, staying away from land for the most part, and then being out over the water in the Gulf, entirely possible that we could be talking about a hurricane coming up to the west coast of Florida. And then, that would obviously raise the stakes for Tampa, for the Big Bend area, and then farther inland as well into South Georgia and into the Carolinas. So still a wide array of possibilities at this point. We're going to talk more about all that coming up.
People were afraid I was contagious.
Evacuate immediately.
Oh no. Go, go!
Oh. Well, the hurricane hunters are busy getting data from Tropical Storm Elsa. This is video from one of NOAA's hurricane hunter planes known as Kermit. And you can see that multi-layered cloud there in the background, pretty typical of tropical skies. A lot of moisture, a lot of buoyancy, and certainly a rough ride from time to time, depending on how strong the storm is. And it was a hurricane for a time, and then it really dialed it back through the day today. It was very disorganized for a lot of the day today, and just more recently we're seeing a little burst of convection or thunderstorms near the center, so it appears to be getting just a little bit stronger, but it's not actually showing up in the data. You see the track of the hurricane hunters as they came down from South Florida and then went across and went back and forth several times across the center. And so this is the data that we have seen here. And the strongest winds that I've seen so far have been about 55 knots or around 63 miles per hour. So, maybe there's a case for it being an even weaker storm. Maybe it's down just a notch to 65 miles per hour. But, often what happens is you see a little bit of a lag in what happens with the storm relative to what you're seeing on satellite. So as I mentioned, there's been this big burst of thunderstorms near the center. For a lot of the day today, it was not looking very good. It was looking pretty ragged, and I think that's perhaps why the winds were down just a bit. Now we're seeing this big burst. Might take another couple of hours for the winds to respond to that, and then maybe it strengthens some, but we may not know that because the hurricane hunters will be back, heading back to the state in another hour or two, and we won't get data until about 4 o'clock in the morning. But certainly the presentation on satellite is better than it's been just about all day long, and it's got more time now out over the open water. It's going to sort of thread the needle between Jamaica and the southern tip of Cuba there. If it can manage to stay south of southeast Cuba, which is right through there, then it'll stay south of those very tall mountains there, and that certainly would be optimal for the storm to maintain that what looks to be a strengthening trend. And so we'll see. I mean, that's going to have everything to do with everything, where exactly it goes, where it is relative to land, and, whether or not this trend holds in the overnight hours. So still a lot to sort out and a very difficult intensity forecast, but we're going to get at least some weather, we know, coming up into Florida come Monday and Tuesday. Molly, over to you.
Thanks, Carl. Well, you mentioned the hurricane hunters in Elsa right now, and it takes a lot of tools to get accurate measurements of tropical storms and hurricanes. We got to look inside a very special aircraft used by the hurricane hunters out of Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi.
Hi, I'm Devin Meister with the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron. I'm going to take you on a tour of our plane. This is a WC-130J, which means it's W is weather modified. This is where our weather officer sits, and he or she is talking with KARCA. KARCA is our liaison to the National Hurricane Center. And this is where our loadmaster sits. And our loadmaster works in coordination with our weather officer on where exactly we do our drops. And these are the drop sondes that are launched through our drop tube. And we're collecting wind speed, wind direction, temperature, and pressure. What's very challenging is that you're flying through essentially a band of thunderstorms, and you have to mitigate that while you're flying through it. Up here is our flight deck, and we have two pilots and a navigator that sits up here. And our navigator is in constant coordination with our weather officer about where the National Hurricane Center wants us to go within the storm. And the navigator has the job of keeping us safe and keeping us away from the most dangerous parts of the storm, which we try to avoid but can't always. We have a very different type of mission to protect the United States and the United States assets. It just so happens we fly into hurricanes instead of combat.
Well, here's a live look at Miami right now. While the latest forecast track takes Miami out of the cone, you're not exactly in the clear either. And Carl, if they aren't in the cone, I think it's important to remember, it's always a good reminder that early on in hurricane season that you can't look at the cone just once and then come back and never look at it again, because it will change. We will see changes, and very well Miami could see some impacts from Elsa.
Yeah, you know, it's so funny too, because when we do interviews with people who are along the coast, I've seen this so many times where, you know, somebody says, well, we were in the cone, so we did X, Y, and Z, or we weren't in the cone, so we, weren't worried about it. And, that's not what the cone is necessarily. The cone is not telling you that you're in trouble or you're not in trouble. And let's talk about what the cone is. It's first and foremost not an impacts cone. It's not showing you where we're likely to get impacts or where we're not likely to get impacts. Rather, it's just showing you the average forecast errors relative to the points that the forecaster picks. And so at the Hurricane Center, the forecaster looks at all of the model data, and he sits down and he comes up with the best guess as to where the storm is going. And then they take those points and they apply the average forecast error for each of those points in time, and those forecast errors grow over time. That's why the cone is getting wider and wider, because of the average forecast error. But keep in mind that a storm is within the cone about 2/3 of the time, so 1/3 of the time it's actually not in the cone.
And our daughter.
The Florida Keys are packed with holiday weekend tourists, and they're all wondering what's going to happen with Elsa south of Cuba. In the meantime, it has been a beautiful day in paradise on this Saturday. Loads of sunshine. Look at the water, almost glassy. Water temp, by the way, 84, ideal for swimming, and just a light breeze. And that's the way it's going to be tomorrow. This is often the case before a tropical system hits an area. We have all the compensating substance or the sinking air, and we get the blue skies. But there are a lot of tourists in town, and we talked to some of them today about what their concerns are as Elsa approaches the first part of the week.
What is your biggest worry for Tropical Storm Elsa?
Not being able to get back to New York. But I mean, it could be worse. We could be stuck in Key West.
So New York just had a ton of heat. How are you dealing with the heat down here?
It's not as bad. New York, we at least get a breeze here. New York was very still for a little bit, but other than that, it's okay. We're still sweating. Got to change the shirt a few times.
You can see in the background that there are a lot of people in town, and they are having a good time. Let's hope Anthony gets that flight back on Monday. Let's talk about the timing again. Tomorrow, fine, mid to upper 80s again, plenty of sunshine. Then, as Elsa comes across Cuba and then into the Florida Straits and the Gulf of Mexico Monday, our weather goes downhill. We're expecting the worst of the weather beginning Monday afternoon through Tuesday morning. Winds could gust over 40 miles an hour. And again, tropical storm watches for the middle and lower Keys. They could be expanded north and certainly into the Florida Peninsula on Sunday. This area no stranger to hurricanes. The last big one was Irma 4 years ago. Last year they had two close calls with Isaias and with Laura.
Thanks, Mike. Here's what we know right now. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency in 15 counties today. Elsa is now blamed for at least 3 deaths in the Caribbean, 1 in St. Lucia, and 2 people were killed in the Dominican Republic when walls collapsed on them. Barbados was also hit hard by Elsa. More than 1,000 people reported damaged homes, and that includes 62 that were completely collapsed. Let's find out the latest on where Elsa is headed. We want to bring in storm specialist Carl Parker. In the last hour or two, this has really started to get interesting. A lot of today, it's looked kind of ragged. The past hour or two, it's thunderstorms have started to explode, and it almost seems like Elsa is finding that perfect path to allow for a little bit of re-intensification.
Yeah, you know, it's threading the needle a little bit right now, and we talked about the fact that it was so fast for the longest period of time, so the low-level center was way out ahead of where the rest of the storm was, and as long as that's happening, it's not going to get more organized. Well, finally, the low-level center started to slow down and allow the rest of the storm to catch up to it, so it started to become more vertically stacked. And I think you're seeing the results of that right now. It's going to be really interesting to see the new model data that comes out, because when you think about the structure of the storm and when it's, you know, sort of on the ropes, which it was for a lot of the day today, when they run models on a storm as it is like that, then, you know, it may indicate that it's not going to do as much in the longer term. Whereas if you see a storm have a big burst, and then that's how the model initializes and they run it out like that, well, that could indicate, you know, a change in the future. And certainly you've got to pay attention when you see a storm getting its act together the way that this one is. Right now, it's a 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm. The hurricane hunters have actually been in the storm, going back and forth, and they have not found winds that strong, which is not surprising because, as I said, it was on the ropes for a lot of the day today, but I think seeing a little bit of a bounce back right now. And then here you see the forecast track and intensities from the Hurricane Center calling for it to be a strong tropical storm, either right along the coast of Cuba, maybe just south, or maybe just a little inland. And, you know, depending on which of those scenarios we end up seeing, that's going to have a huge impact on what it is as it's coming off of Cuba and into the Florida Straits, and then out into the open water of the Eastern Gulf and along the west coast of Florida. So, you know, if it does strengthen tonight while it's out over the open water, and then it manages to, you know, stay just offshore for most of the time when it's coming up along Cuba, well, that could have a huge impact on what it is coming up into Florida. And I would not rule out a hurricane coming up to the west coast of Florida or even to southwest Florida. Now, this is what I really want you to see. And, you know, this track right here stops at the 8 o'clock position, so it's actually probably a little farther ahead. By the time we get the 11 o'clock position, it's going to catch up. So, you know, it's still on the left side of where all the deep convection is. But just the fact that we got a big burst, and then we got a second big burst, and you're seeing this very large cloud shield here. We call that the central dense overcast that is pretty well formed. I mean, that structure is much more impressive than anything that we have seen through the course of the day today. So it does appear that it's trying to get its act together, and it's got some time out over the open water before it really starts to interact with land. We'll have more on this coming up in a few minutes.
When you order Domino's.
Well, parts of the Eastern Caribbean have taken a lashing from Tropical Storm Elsa. This is what it looked like in Barbados on Friday. There were reports of homes that collapsed, as well as power and water outages. Thankfully, no reports of deaths or serious injuries here. And so here is the latest on the storm. We are now watching a strong tropical storm just shy of what you need for a hurricane. The hurricane hunters have been out in the system. So far, they have not found winds higher than 65 miles per hour, at least based on their scan of the surface. And so we'll see if the storm actually is weakening a little bit. We've got a new advisory coming out at 11 p.m. But I'll tell you, what's been interesting is the satellite presentation. We'll get more into that in just a second. It really does look like it is making a run at getting a little bit stronger. So there's the forecast track and intensities from the Hurricane Center, looking for a strong tropical storm to track along or very close to Cuba, or perhaps even over Cuba for a long time, and then come out into the Gulf of Mexico and into Florida, perhaps as a strong tropical storm. But there's really an array of possibilities because of this land interaction and because, of what we've been looking at for the last couple of days, this, structure that has really been struggling today in particular. We could be looking at something that's not very strong coming out on the north side of Cuba, or we could be looking at a hurricane that is coming up towards Florida. And I wanted to show you this loop over the last 12 hours. I've slowed it down a little bit. So you see the low-level center and you see all the thunderstorms that were kind of right behind it. As long as that's the case, if you've got a low-level center that's moving along, it's racing along, and you've got all this weather that's behind it, and they're not really together, well, then it's not going to get more organized. But watch what happened at the very last minute. The low-level center slowed down, and then all that weather started to catch up and started to get a little bit more towards the center of the circulation. The center of circulation is actually a little farther west than the depiction right here because it stops at the 8 p.m. position. So it will catch up when we get the new advisory. It's probably closer to being about there. That having been said, there's been this big bursting of thunderstorms and, actually a very healthy upper level environment with the upper level cloud kind of spreading out in all directions. And, when you see a big burst like that, you kind of sit up and go, whoa, this thing looks like it's starting to get going again. And it's got plenty of time out over the open water. If you sort of extrapolate this track coming up towards Cuba, it's going to get really close. Now, if it were to come up like this, well, that would make a big difference because there are very tall mountains on the south side of Cuba, right in there. Very tall mountains, 6,500 feet high. So if it took more of a right and came up into South Cuba, well, that certainly would have an impact on the track. Doesn't really look like it's going to do that. It looks like it's going to sort of thread the needle between South Cuba and Jamaica. And again, with this big bursting that's going on right now, that certainly has my attention. And the other thing that you've got here is you've got very warm ocean water. Water temperatures are in the middle 80s, the upper 80s, as high as 90 degrees in some areas here. And what we're looking at here is ocean heat content. So it's not just the temperature of the water at the surface, it's also how deep that warm water is. And so when the storm is moving along and it's churning up the water, if there's just a shallow layer of warm water and then it gets cold below, well, that can have an impact on the storm because as the storm churns up the water, it makes it a little bit cooler. But if the water is warm at the surface and then water is warm below that and below that, if there's a depth to that warmth, well, the storm can churn up the water all at once and it's still just getting into this warm water, which is putting more warmth into the atmosphere and continuing to fuel the storm. So if the storm stays south of Cuba for a longer period of time, and looking like it does right now, then it's got a better chance of being a stronger storm coming up to Florida. Molly, over to you.
Well, Tropical Storm Elsa is throwing a wrench in rescue efforts at the condo that collapsed in Surfside, Florida. Fears are that the approaching storm could cause the remaining tower to fall. Officials will suspend the rescue mission. Officials have now decided to demolish the rest of the condo tower as soon as tomorrow. First responders have now spent over a week sifting through piles of rubble with more than 120 people still unaccounted for. And time is running out for demolition crews to bring down the rest of that condo tower. We want to bring back in storm specialist Carl Parker because the forecast, very important in Miami, and a lot of eyes on this system as it pushes over Cuba, because you just mentioned this is the big question. If we see this get torn apart over Cuba, this could very easily become an eastern loaded side storm, and that could push a slug of moisture right into South Florida.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, because if it does end up going farther to the east, that means it spends more time over Cuba, which means it's going to be a weaker system, which means it's going to be more of a rainmaker than anything else. If it goes farther to the west or stays south of Cuba for a long time and then comes up briefly over Cuba and then towards the west coast of Florida, that means it could be a stronger storm. So the upshot there is that it is less likely that we get significant wind in South Florida, but we could get heavier rain no matter what happens, because that rain could extend well away from that center. So here you see the future radar, and we see some waves of rain coming through on Monday. This could certainly change really drastically between now and then. When you're looking at convection this far out, well, that can really change. I mean, it's just a little too far out to have any sort of reliable fine grain model forecast. That having been said, you can get the flavor of it, and the flavor is there's going to be waves of rain coming in. That's going to start on Monday. We're going to get some thunderstorms on Monday. We'll see more of that Monday night. We'll see more of that Tuesday. And so that certainly is going to complicate the ongoing search there in Surfside, as you've got plenty of wet weather coming in. Welcome back to our special coverage of Tropical Storm Elsa. We have the brand new advisory. We'll tell you about that in a moment. Tropical storm watches now in effect for the lower Keys, including Key West. Some very strong wind could be coming in on Monday and then moving up towards the west coast of Florida on Tuesday. So we're looking at the potential for wind, for very heavy rain. There could be some storm surge as well. Here is the new advisory from the National Hurricane Center. We talked about the fact that the hurricane hunters had been out in the system. They did not find winds that were higher than 65 miles per hour. So not a surprise. We've seen a slight downgrade in the wind speed there from 70 to 65. Forward speed. This is really something. West-northwest at 17 miles per hour. That's really important because this thing was racing along at nearly 30 miles per hour earlier today, and that's a big part of why it was so disorganized. Now that low-level center is slowing down, and that's allowing it to become more organized as a result. Now, let's take a look at the new forecast track and intensities from the Hurricane Center. And so, once again, looking for a strong tropical storm to pass perhaps just south of Cuba or right along the coast, and then begins to work inland. Now, where exactly it comes inland is going to have an impact, certainly, then comes out perhaps as a mid-grade tropical storm towards the Keys, and that would be the second half of the day on Monday, and then out of the open water and coming towards the west coast of Florida, perhaps strengthening at that time, becoming a stronger tropical storm. But, I want you to know, as always, there's still an array of possibilities. It's possible that the storm spends a little more time over land, gets a little more disorganized, is not as strong. It's also possible that it's more organized and then just comes through Cuba and comes out and goes gangbusters in the Florida Straits and becomes, say, a hurricane as it's coming up towards the west coast of Florida. So all of that is really on the table at this point. I mean, that's always the case. Intensity is very, very difficult to forecast. This is the best guess right now, but certainly, things could change in the next 24 to 48 hours. But the thing that really stands out more than anything else is how this storm has changed in just the last, say, 12 hours. I'm going to go back 12 hours and we'll take a look at the loop. And I talked about the fact that that low-level center was out ahead of the storm. And so as that was the case, as it was disjointed, the low-level center here and the weather here, it just wasn't getting organized. And you can really see, how the convection right in there, I mean, it just didn't look like an organized storm at all. Now compare that to what it looks like right now, and it looks way different. I mean, it's, got this really symmetrical area of, dense overcast here. It's not perfectly co-located with the low-level center. The low-level center is still ahead of where this convection is and where the mid-level center is, but those two things are getting closer. They're getting closer. So I would not be at all surprised if by the time we get to tomorrow morning, we're actually looking at a stronger storm, because it's got some time out over the open water, though it's going to come probably very, very close to Jamaica. So, you know, these things are always fascinating, and we've seen a real change in the character of this storm just within the last several hours. Molly?
Thanks, Carl. Elsa hit the Caribbean island of Barbados as a Category 1 hurricane. Let's take a look at some of the damage. The storm damaged several homes, knocked down trees, knocked out power and water to many parts of the island, but thankfully there were no reports of serious injuries or death. Elsa is the first hurricane to hit Barbados in over 60 years. Here's a look at more damage from Elsa in Foul Bay, Barbados. Strong winds ripped apart the roof off this building. We did see wind gusts recorded in Barbados, 86 miles per hour. So that certainly will do some damage, just like what you're seeing right there, very close to the ocean. And here's a look at some of the storm surge and wind and rain Elsa brought to Barbados. You can see the wind whipping up a lot of those waves as it spills on shore. A lot of wind, a lot of water as it slammed right into Barbados. So that's a look at what Elsa did while it was a hurricane. It has since been downgraded to a tropical storm, but there's something else that could help protect parts of the U.S. from Elsa's wrath. We want to bring in storm specialist Carl Parker. The answer to that is potentially Cuba. But what we've seen you were just talking about this, the past 12 hours has been very interesting for Elsa. It took on more of that ragged appearance, and sometimes when that happens, the center can change where it is. And what we've seen is this has moved a little bit farther down to the south, and because of that, it may not interact with some of Cuba's higher terrain.
Yeah, it doesn't appear that it's going to be coming squarely over the highest terrain in Cuba. So, you know, that was something that you can always, you know, you can kind of hope that it's going to, you know, get tangled up with these very tall mountains in, you know, the Caribbean. In terms of U.S. impacts, of course, you know, our heart's going out to the people of Cuba and Hispaniola, because they're going to be getting a lot of very heavy rain from this thing. But that does not appear to be the case at this time. That, you know, when you look at the new forecast track and the current position of the storm here, it's going to pass just to the north of Jamaica, you know, maybe just gets over that little section of the tip of southeastern Cuba. But for the most part, it appears it's going to spend a lot of time with the center out over these very warm waters in the Caribbean. And so that is going to allow it to get more and more organized. We'll have more coming up.
Oh, just one.
Jake from State Farm.
Tropical storm Elsa is charging through the Caribbean right now as it heads towards Florida and the southeastern U.S. The Florida Keys are now under a tropical storm watch. Meteorologist Mike Seidel is in Key West as people anxiously await the latest tropical threat. Mike?
Good evening from Key West, where those watches are flying for the middle and lower Keys. All eyes watching to the south of Cuba tonight to see where Elsa ends up and how strong it is once it gets up into the Florida Straits and Gulf of Mexico. We'll talk impacts and check in with Carl Parker with the latest analysis in just a moment.
Thanks, Mike. Here's what we know right now. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency in 15 counties today. In Surfside, Florida, rescuers suspended search and rescue operations at the collapsed condo building this afternoon. Officials are quickly preparing for demolition ahead of the storm because strong winds could bring down the rest of the building. At least one death has been reported in St. Lucia, and 2 more people were killed in the Dominican Republic after walls collapsed on them, according to the country's Emergency Operations Center. Let's get the latest on Elsa and where the storm is headed from Carl Parker. We want to bring in you. This has been a fascinating storm to watch over the past 12 hours. It struggled earlier today. Now it seems like it's starting to pick back up.
Yeah, I tell you, it's really impressive from a satellite perspective. We actually saw in the new advisory a slight downgrade in terms of winds from 70 to 65 miles per hour. But, oftentimes there's a little bit of a lag between what you see on the satellite and what's actually going on in the storm. And so I think that slight downgrade was, a relic basically of what was occurring earlier today. Now we're seeing this big bursting of thunderstorms occurring near the center. So it's going to be very interesting to see if that continues over the next several hours, because we could actually be looking at a strengthening phase. It's sitting out over the open water. The water is very, very warm. It's going to be close to a lot of different land masses. Part of it is over Hispaniola. Part of it is going to be over Jamaica. Part of it certainly is going to be over Cuba. But the center, the core of the storm, I think is going to be spending a lot of time over this very warm water, and that will give it some opportunity to get its act together. So right now, a 65-mile-per-hour storm. It is moving west-northwest at 17 miles per hour. That is down considerably from earlier today. Earlier today, it was moving at nearly 30 miles per hour. And so it slowed, by almost half. I mean, that is huge, and I'll show you why here in a moment. I want to show you the latest forecast track and intensities from the Hurricane Center. So they're calling for it to be a strong tropical storm just south of Cuba, and then crossing land here in Cuba for a time. That is likely going to have an impact on the intensity. So you see the change there from a 70-mile-per-hour storm to a 50-mile-per-hour storm. And then beyond that, it comes out into the open water of the Gulf of Mexico, re-strengthens somewhat. But keep in mind, 60-mile-per-hour tropical storm, not terribly far away from being a hurricane. So we certainly can't rule that out. It is possible that it could overachieve and get even stronger. Some of the modeling has indicated that it might be even weaker coming off of Cuba. But I think, the fact that it's going to spend so much time out over the open water now and is less likely to tangle with those very tall mountains in southeastern Cuba, I think that means that it's probably got a better chance of being a little bit stronger. And then beyond that, a strong tropical storm coming up into northern Florida and southeast Georgia. So look at this loop here. And as you follow the low-level center, you notice that for a lot of the day today, the low-level center preceded all of the weather. And so there was this dislocation between the low-level center and the mid-level center where all the thunderstorms were located. And when those things are dislocated and moving along like that, well, it's not going to become more organized. And in fact, it's going to become less organized. And that's exactly what you saw when you look at the cloud pattern here, like right in there, very, very disorganized. Not much going on there at all. It was definitely on the wane, on the ropes for a time. Now, look at the last few frames, and this is where the storm is slowing down. It's going from 29 miles per hour to 23 miles per hour to now 17 miles per hour. And so that is allowing that mid-level center, and it's allowing those thunderstorms to catch up with the low-level center, and now they're becoming vertically stacked, and now the tropical cyclone is working optimally. And it's, basically firing on all cylinders. And it's taking in that warm and humid air, and thunderstorms are firing about the low pressure center. And, as it's releasing heat, it's getting even stronger. We'll see if it's getting stronger, but it certainly looks like it may be doing that. I mean, when you look close up here at this presentation, look at the bursting of the thunderstorms that's going on. You see this, what's called the central dense overcast right in there. And then if you look at the edges of this, you see these little striations right in there. That's indicative of very healthy thunderstorm activity coming out of the center of this thing. And so, this is a very impressive system right now as compared to what we saw earlier today. And, you got to wonder what impact that is going to have on the downstream forecast. We'll talk more about that coming up in a moment. First, though, a tropical storm watch now in effect for the Florida Keys, and meteorologist Mike Seidel spent the evening in Key West as people prepared.
Here in the Florida Keys, everybody is keeping an eye to the south of Cuba. That's where Elsa is tonight. It's slowing down. The big question is, how strong is Elsa as it makes its way up towards the Keys and Florida Monday and Tuesday? Right now we're expecting a tropical storm. Today it was tropical, but it was sunny. Take a look at the pictures. Beautiful blue skies, just a few fair weather Q. Folks out on the jet skis and the pool, trying to stay cool. It was 91 today in Key West, only their third 90-degree day so far this year. But the locals who have been through the likes of Irma 4 years ago, that was a Cat 4 that came in just north of here and had a couple of close calls last year. We had tropical storm warnings up for Laura. Remember, Laura went into Louisiana as a Cat 4. Here, just some wind and rain, but they're concerned and they're prepared.
Tropical storm Elsa is on its way. Have you been preparing?
Yes, we always prepare when there's hurricanes or storms coming. We already have the non-perishable items, the water, normal batteries, all that stuff.
She's doing the right thing. Always be prepared during hurricane season. We're in the early stages, and this is very early for a hurricane to come in from east of the islands. So we'll see how it shakes out and what kind of impacts we end up with. But the bottom line, rain and wind kicking up here starting Monday afternoon.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. And once again, returning to this satellite picture, I mean, this is really something to see this change the way that it has. It looked really ragged, really disorganized for a lot of the day today. I think the winds responded to what was going on for a lot of the day today. We saw it go from a 70-mile-per-hour storm to a 65-mile-per-hour storm. But now we're seeing this big bursting of thunderstorms going on. You're seeing a lot of symmetry to the cloud pattern. It's not symmetrical with respect to the center at this point, but these deep thunderstorms are catching up to the center because the center really slowed down, and you're seeing this really impressive what we call central dense overcast. And notice what's called this transverse banding. See these little features that are kind of like filaments that are coming out of the cloud there? I mean, that's indicating thunderstorms that are really powerfully bursting up through the center or very close to the center, and then rapidly you're seeing that cloud shield spread out, so much so that it's got little fingers, little tendrils almost that are coming out. That is often an indication of a strengthening tropical cyclone. It is a shame. I don't know how much longer the hurricane hunters are going to be out in the system, but I suspect if they were out there 2 hours from now, something like that, 3 hours from now, I think we might be looking at a very different intensity than 65 miles per hour. Could even be on its way to becoming a hurricane again, but they won't be out in the system until 4 o'clock tomorrow morning after this flight goes back. Now, the center is going to come really close to Jamaica, as you can see. We were wondering, how close it was going to be to Cuba. Looks like it's going to be well south of southeast Cuba, but it's going to come really close to Jamaica. So, I think that could have some impact on the center of circulation. It's not at all unusual for there to be sort of wobbles in the track of the storm. You can really clearly see it, just a slight wobble there. So we'll see if that holds. Maybe it'll wobble again and pass just north. But, what I'm seeing on the satellite picture right now is really, really impressive. And then it's got time out over the open water of the Caribbean, and this water has very high heat content. What does that mean? Well, it's not just that the water is warm, and the water is very warm, 85 to 90 degrees here just south of Cuba. It's not just that, it's that there's depth to that warmth as well. So as the storm is churning up the water, it's not churning up cooler water from below, it's churning up warm water from below. So even as the storm is churning up the water, it's got this limitless supply of warm water, and there's a flux between the warm water and the warm air, the warm and humid air, what we call the boundary layer. And so as long as it's continuing to fuel the storm, then it's going to continue to do well, assuming that the other atmospherics are optimal. And I think they look pretty good right now with, based on the cloud pattern that I'm seeing. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see. I mean, you really want to pay attention tomorrow morning in particular. When you wake up, it's going to be fascinating to see what this thing looks like when it's up in this position, still sitting over very warm water, doing what it's doing now. It will have some time over land, but rather than running long ways along Cuba, it's just going to do this quick little trip over one section of Cuba that happens to be a little bit flatter. So, this is why I by no means would I take a hurricane coming towards Florida off the table at this point. Even though the forecast is calling for a 60-mile-per-hour tropical storm, you know, certainly that's a possibility. There is going to be some shear in place. There is going to be this land interaction. Could very well be a 50-mile-per-hour tropical storm, or maybe even weaker as it comes north of Cuba. But by no means would I take that off the table. I think there's this chance that it ends up being stronger just based on what's happening right now. And here's the forecast showing you this heavy rain. This is a model forecast showing you heavy rain coming into Cuba, and then the reorganization right in there. And so, you know, a lot of weather coming into southwest Florida, heavy rain, and then plenty of wind as well. And obviously that's going to be amplified depending on the intensity of the circulation. So, you know, Molly, it's really interesting because it doesn't always happen this way, but sometimes, in one shift, you can see a really big change in the character of a storm.
And we've seen that happen pretty quickly, and that leaves a lot of scenarios still in play here. And I think that across Cuba is going to be the most important. Well, much of South Florida's Atlantic coastline is outside of the forecast cone for Elsa. However, that doesn't mean cities like Fort Lauderdale and Miami are in the clear. These are live pictures from Fort Lauderdale. The Florida governor today declared a state of emergency for 15 counties across the state. Fort Lauderdale is not part of that executive order. However, the governor said he may alter it as Elsa's path becomes clear. And as we talked about, there's still a lot of scenarios in play. I do want to talk about the heavy rain, because if this does come on shore as a tropical storm, of course, rain is going to be a big concern. There's no such thing as just a tropical storm. This is the European model, and I want you to keep in mind that the European model has not dealt with Elsa great so far. In fact, it completely washes it out over Cuba, but it does leave a footprint of some heavier rain starting in Key West and then continuing across the Florida peninsula, and it keeps the heavy rain off the Atlantic coast, off the coast of Georgia, as well as the Carolinas. The American model paints a completely different picture, bringing an eastern loaded side storm right from Tampa, Clearwater, Sarasota through Fort Myers, especially down into Captiva, Sanibel, all the way down into the southern portion of the Keys, down into Key West, where we could see 5 to 8 inches of rain. It's a very different picture from what the European model is painting. The rain total forecast, Tampa, about an inch of rain. I think if we see this, as Carl just mentioned, the intensity of this pickup, that could lead to some higher rainfall totals and also some higher wind speeds. But right now, look at this, Tuesday into Tuesday night, 40 to 50 mile per hour wind gust. And that's what we're going to be seeing as Elsa starts to move in. This does clear out pretty quickly. So Wednesday, still some thunderstorms, but Wednesday night, pretty calm. Let's move down to the southern half and the southern tip of Florida, where Miami could see an inch of rain. Fort Myers, a little bit more for you over into the Naples area. And Miami escaping a lot of the really gusty winds, but still seeing some thunderstorms Monday all the way through Tuesday. Fort Myers, look at this. You're going to see some of those gusty winds Tuesday into Tuesday night, 30 to 35 miles per hour. Carl?
Well, a slow-moving front stretching from Texas to southern Georgia is dumping a lot of rain on parts of the South and the Gulf Coast states. Here's a look at the rain in Midland, Texas, where the summers are usually very dry and hot, but of course you can get some really serious storms there in West Texas. So we've seen some rain in southeast Texas tonight, as well as southern Louisiana along the I-10 corridor, and just a terrific amount of wet weather over the last 48 hours. You see these huge areas where we've had 3 to 4 to 5 and even more inches of rain, especially south of I-10 in Louisiana and then just north in Texas. So we watched a front come down through the southeast, brought in some drier, slightly cooler air. It's been really comfortable across a lot of the south, but not so along the Gulf Coast. That's where the moisture remains, and in fact is actually going to turn tail and move back northward. And so along with that, we're going to see a pretty broad area of scattered storms. That from Houston into the Hill Country tomorrow across the I-10 corridor in Florida. We see more of that on Monday. Of course, we're starting to see the impacts of the tropical system there on Monday, and then more of that into Tuesday as well in Florida. But just generally all across the Gulf Coast, it is going to be really wet for the beginning of the week. A large area of scattered showers and thunderstorms. We're going to have much more on Tropical Storm Elsa coming up.
If you have a typical airline.
Evacuate immediately.
Oh no. Go, go!
Well, the hurricane hunters have been busy getting data from Tropical Storm Elsa. This video from one of NOAA's hurricane hunter planes known as Kermit. Earlier today, you see a lot of that deep tropical moisture there, cloud at several levels of the atmosphere. That's pretty typical in a tropical system. You got a lot of moisture and a lot of buoyancy, a lot of lifting, and so you can get clouds at multiple levels of the storm. And really interesting that the hurricane hunters are out in the storm tonight. I can't wait to see what they find over the next passes here. You see the flight emanating from South Florida, and they've gone across several times. Now they're going to be going across the south side, and I think probably turning back to the northwest and coming across the center. But, you know, when you look at this thing, I mean, what has happened in the satellite presentation in, you know, just the last couple of hours has been remarkable. Huge bursting of thunderstorms, really, really impressive. That is, you know, closer to the center than it's been all day today. The low-level center has been outrunning most of the weather for most of the day, and so it's been really disorganized. Now it's slowing down and getting, you know, more squarely underneath that deep convection. And notice also, you know, first of all, you see this, you know, even though it's not symmetrical with the center, you've got a symmetrical area of high cloud that's called the central dense overcast. But also, notice this little banding right in here. You see these little filaments, little tendrils that are coming out right there, and to some extent right in there. That's called transverse banding. And that is usually indicative of a storm that is getting stronger. And so, you know, this is why I say I'm really interested to see what they find. When they come across the south side and they go back across the middle here, are they going to find winds that are stronger than what we're seeing right now? It takes some time for this to occur. It's not like the moment that you see a difference in the satellite presentation, the winds respond. There's usually a little bit of a lag before that occurs. And so I think, you know, part of why the storm has gotten weaker today is because of what it was for a lot of the day. Well, now it appears to be getting more organized, and the winds are probably going to respond accordingly, if not, you know, immediately, then certainly over the next few hours. But here you see, you know, the latest pass and the winds, you know, into tropical storm force range. But again, they're on the south side. And so as they come back across the center, that's when it's going to be really interesting to see. And then tomorrow morning, there's another flight from the NOAA hurricane hunters. And we'll see what happens at that point. We'll see what it looks like at that point. But it's got plenty of time out over the open water. So it's got more time to get organized before it actually crosses Cuba. And that's going to be towards late tomorrow. Molly, over to you.
Thanks, Carl. Well, it takes a lot of tools to get accurate measurements of tropical storms and hurricanes. We got to look inside a very special aircraft used by the hurricane hunters out of Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi.
Hi, I'm Devin Meister with the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron. I'm going to take you on a tour of our plane. This is a WC-130J, which means it's W is weather modified. This is where our weather officer sits, and he or she is talking with Karka. Karka is our liaison to the National Hurricane Center. And this is where our loadmaster sits. And our loadmaster works in coordination with our weather officer on where exactly we do our drops. And these are the drop sondes that are launched through our drop tube. And we're collecting wind speed, wind direction, temperature, and pressure. What's very challenging is that you're flying through essentially a band of thunderstorms, and you have to mitigate that while you're flying through it. Up here is our flight deck, and we have two pilots and a navigator that sits up here. And our navigator is in constant coordination with our weather officer about where the National Hurricane Center wants us to go within the storm. And the navigator has the job of keeping us safe and keeping us away from the most dangerous parts of the storm, which we try to avoid but can't always. We have a very different type of mission to protect the United States and the United States assets. It just so happens we fly into hurricanes instead of combat.
Here's a live look at Miami right now. A nice evening in Miami. While the latest forecast track takes Miami out of the cone, you're not exactly in the clear either. Carl, we've been watching this storm, of course, every step of the way this evening. It's been taken a fascinating turn over the last 2 hours or so. And I think that just the example of what we've seen is why you can't look at the cone once and then just keep that snapshot in your mind as what's going to happen, because as we see some of these intensities go up and down, we will see changes to the track.
Sure, and you know, if you had a much stronger storm coming into southwest Florida, well, that would raise the stakes for Miami. I mean, there's so many different ways, and you know, Florida's not real wide to begin with, and so you know, it's often true that as one side of the state is hit hard, you know, harder, there are impacts on the other side of the state. And one of the big ones is probably going to be heavier rain. This is a model forecast, and you know, when you're looking at convection or fine details this far out, well, you know, take it with a bag of salt. But the idea basically is that Monday into Tuesday, I'm going to step back a little bit here so we can kind of follow this. Here we go on Monday. Storms are stepping up. We see more of that into Monday evening, more of that into Tuesday as well. A lot of rain on the way for South Florida as the search efforts continue there in Surfside. We'll have much more on Elsa coming up.
Get more out of summer with 4th.
The Florida Keys are packed with holiday weekend tourists, and they're all wondering what's going to happen with Elsa south of Cuba. In the meantime, it has been a beautiful day in paradise on this Saturday. Loads of sunshine. Look at the water, almost glassy. Water temp, by the way, 84, ideal for swimming, and just a light breeze. And that's the way it's going to be tomorrow. This is often the case before a tropical system hits an area. We have all the compensating substance or the sinking air, and we get the blue skies. But there are a lot of tourists in town, and we talked to some of them today about what their concerns are as Elsa approaches the first part of the week.
What is your biggest worry for Tropical Storm Elsa?
Not being able to get back to New York. But I mean, it could be worse. You could be stuck in Key West.
So New York just had a ton of heat. How are you dealing with the heat down here?
It's not as bad. New York, we at least get a breeze here. New York was very still for a little bit, but other than that, it's okay. We're, you know, still sweating. Got to change the shirt a few times.
You can see in the background that there are a lot of people in town, and they are having a good time. Let's hope Anthony gets that flight back on Monday. Let's talk about the timing again. Tomorrow, fine, mid to upper 80s again, plenty of sunshine. Then, as Elsa comes across Cuba and then into the Florida Straits and the Gulf of Mexico Monday, our weather goes downhill. We're expecting the worst of the weather beginning Monday afternoon through Tuesday morning. Winds could gust over 40 miles an hour. And again, tropical storm watches for the middle and lower Keys. They could be expanded north and certainly into the Florida Peninsula on Sunday. This area no stranger to hurricanes. The last big one was Irma 4 years ago. Last year they had two close calls with Isaias and with Laura.
Thanks, Mike. Here's what we know right now. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis declared a state of emergency in 15 counties today. Elsa is now blamed for at least 3 deaths in the Caribbean, 1 in St. Lucia. 2 people were killed in the Dominican Republic when walls collapsed on them. Barbados was also hit hard by Elsa. More than 1,000 people reported damaged homes, including 62 that completely collapsed. Now let's find out the latest on where Elsa is heading. Storm specialist Carl Parker is here. And Carl, I think one of the most striking changes that we've seen over the past 12 hours or so is that the forward speed of this, it raced through the Lesser Antilles at nearly 30 miles per hour. And now it's almost cut that speed in half. And because of that, we've seen some of the structure come back in place. Yeah, it's definitely looking more organized than it has all day, really. It's just amazing what a change we have seen here in the last few hours. So right now we're looking at a 65-mile-per-hour tropical storm. The hurricane hunters have been out in the system sampling the winds, and I think because a lot of the degradation took its toll today, the wind's actually down a little bit. It's going to be fascinating to see if they're able to find any stronger winds, just because, you know, within the last couple of hours, there's been this really big burst of convection, you know, nearer the center of the storm, though, you know, not right with the center of the storm, but it's been catching up to the center of the storm. So there's the forecast track and intensities calling for a strong tropical storm near hurricane to be passing south of Cuba. Then eventually it does have to cross Cuba. And so, you know, we'll see, you know, how long that takes and what kind of a toll that takes on the system. It is most likely going to weaken it. To what extent, we're not precisely sure. The forecast calling for it to be a mid-grade tropical storm, but then it's going to have some time out over the open water
once again coming up towards Florida. Now, going to be interesting to see also what happens with the wind shear. There are going to be some stronger winds that are sitting over top of the circulation as it's coming up across western Florida. Sometimes those can be detrimental, but sometimes they can actually be helpful. They can help to evacuate mass. And so, there's still a lot of open questions here. I would not say that it's out of the question that we're looking at a hurricane along the west coast of Florida. And as a matter of fact, the average forecast error as you get farther out in time in terms of intensity is about 15 miles. So, they're calling for a 60-mile-per-hour tropical storm right now. You bump that up by 15, you've got a Category 1 hurricane. But look at what's happened here on the satellite presentation in the last 12 hours. So, for the longest time, that low-level center was out ahead of the convection, very disorganized. You could see little pockets of thunderstorms, but really didn't look like much. And then look at the character change in just the last couple of hours. You see how there's this really well-defined sort of central dense overcast, not completely co-located with the center, but getting more so, trying to catch up. And sometimes the center will actually reform based on where this big bursting of convection is. So, it's going to be really interesting to see if this holds, if this continues through the night. The storm appears to be making a beeline for Jamaica. It is forecast to turn more to the north, but that better happen soon. You can see where it's been going here, and you can see where the forecast is taking it. So we better see that turn more quickly, or it's going to be more squarely over Jamaica.